And the topic tonight is one that could not be more important and more serious for Jews and non-Jews alike. And that is the current conflict that is going on uh, between Israel and Hamas. So I'm sure you all remember the horrendous massacre that occurred on October 7th when 1,200 people in Israel were slaughtered in the most brutal fashion. And that was followed by the now 3-month war in Gaza. And these events have provoked intense emotional reactions. It has unleashed ugly eruptions of anti Semitism uh, here in the United States and around the world as well. And it has also unleashed Islamophobia worldwide. Photos of the corpses of people at the music festival and the kibbutzim, along with videos of children in Gaza being pulled from debris, all of that has inflamed emotions on all sides. So, my purpose today is not just to focus on what is going on in Gaza at this moment, but rather what I would like to do is to offer a historical perspective on how we have arrived at this horrific, bloody confrontation today. And to do so is to really navigate some treacherous waters in an attempt to present issues and evidence as objectively as possible. And that is not an easy task. Most of the information that we hear on television or through the internet or in newspapers is either on one side or the other. I am going to try to present the arguments on both sides. Now, many Jews regard the state of Israel as sacrosanct, and such reverence is really understandable given the tortured and sometimes horrific historical experience of the Jewish people. So, for many Jews, the land of Israel is more than just a country. It's an entity that represents redemption and rebirth following the near annihilation of Jews in the Holocaust. Israel represents for Jews a refuge in the event of any future attempted genocide. It also serves as a validation and a guarantee for the continuity of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. And because of all that, many Jews regard any criticism of Israel's history, its leaders, or its policies as intolerably offensive. Some regard any criticism of Israel as anti Semitic. On the other hand, history has not been exactly kind to Palestinians, although they have not had to confront the mass destruction that Jews faced during World War II. Nevertheless, many Palestinians were displaced after the establishment of the State of Israel, forced to live in squalid refugee camps. And Palestinians have been scorned by fellow Arabs and by some Israelis. And their dream for a national state has thus far been unsuccessful. Now, the Israeli Palestinian conflict has always been highly contentious, very controversial. But the debate has too often been marked by misinformation, distortions, and at times outright lies. Some Israelis argue that Arab countries should take in all Palestinians, while Palestinians maintain that a Jewish homeland should have been carved out of Germany, the country responsible for the Holocaust. So, what I would like to do is to advance arguments and perspectives from both sides so that you get a sense of how we arrived at the point we are at today. And to do so, I will rely on verifiable historical facts and hopefully to present the issues as objectively as possible. So, how did we get to this place where we are today? What are the causes of the war between Israel and Hamas? Well, in a nutshell, the problem comes down to two peoples claiming the right to the same land. And that is probably the only thing that the opposing sides agree upon. Extremists on each side refuse to even acknowledge the other side. Some on the Israeli side argue that there never was a Palestinian people or even a place called Palestine. They refer to those Arabs living in that land before 1948 not as Palestinians, but as Jordanians or southern Syrians. Some on the other side refuse to acknowledge the Israeli state. Instead, they refer to it as the Zionist entity. So, who is entitled to the land that Zionists refer to as Israel and Palestinians call Palestine? And when we talk about this land, it is about the size of New Jersey, as you can see on this map. Which side is more justified in the current conflict? Well, the answer to that question depends on where you begin. And this is where historical understanding is crucial. Some in Israel insist that the current crisis began on October 7th. But many Palestinians insist that it originated in 1948 in what they referred to as the Nakba, the catastrophe, the establishment of Israel. And others point to ancient history to explain the origin of the upheaval in the Middle East today. Each side maintains that it has the more legitimate claim based on history, religion, and culture. So let's start with the historical claims of both sides. The ancient Hebrews were said to be descended from Jacob, and they settled in the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River about 1200 before the Common Era, BCE. In the process, they fought a number of enemies, including a group of people identified in the Jewish Bible as the Philistines, who inhabited this area of Philistia. Now, the Jews of the ancient world referred to their realm as the land of Israel, which was comprised of what is modern day Israel today, along with Gaza and the West Bank. And ancient Israel was centered around the city of Jerusalem. At the heart of this city lay the holiest site to Jews, the Great Temple. The Western Wall today is what remains of the Second Temple that was built in 516 BCE, before the Common Era. The ancient Israelis specifically referred to the land that makes up the West Bank today as Judea and Samaria. By the year 70 CE, in the Common Era, the Israelites were defeated by Rome, and after several failed rebellions, the Romans expelled Jews from their homeland. The diffusion of Jews is known by the Greek word diaspora, meaning dispersed. And as you can see on this map, the Romans dispersed the Jews living in ancient Israel, and Jews then migrated to various parts of Europe, other parts of the Middle East, and even as far as Asia. Now, it is possible that a handful of Jews remained in what was then called ancient Israel, but almost the entire Jewish population had been scattered from that land. And so, from the 2nd century until the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Jews were without a national homeland. Those who support the idea of a Jewish national homeland are referred to as Zionists. And Zionists claim that Jews have a legitimate historical claim to the land of Israel. Now, in opposition to the claims of Zionists, Palestinian spokesmen often refer to historic Palestine, which they understand to include all of the present-day state of Israel, plus the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, the same territory that the ancient Hebrews occupied. Now, let us take a look at the word Palestine. There is no scholarly consensus on the origin of the word Palestine. A derivative of that word first appeared in Greek literature in the 5th century before the Common Era, when the Greek historian Herodotus used the word Palestine to refer to the coastal strip inhabited by the Philistines. After the Romans crushed a Jewish revolt in the year 132, they renamed the area Syria Palestina, as you see on this map. And so this area in purple, part of it encompassed ancient Israel, but the Romans referred to it as Syria Palestina. And they did so to minimize any Jewish identity with the land of ancient Israel. The idea on the part of the Romans was to erase the Jewish presence from Israel by first exiling Jews and then renaming their homeland after their biblical enemies, the Philistines. It was meant as a final humiliation to the Jews on the part of Romans. Now, what happened to this land over time? Well, various empires came and went, each of them swallowing up this tiny tract of land. Some of these empires preserved the Roman names of Syria and Palestina, using them in reference to provinces in that region. And this province then became part of the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, the land that you see here in orange. And after that, there were several different Muslim empires that controlled the area of ancient Israel. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were built in the early 8th century, right adjacent to the Temple Mount that you see on this photograph above the Western Wall. And so the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque represent two of the holiest sites in the Islamic religion. And it is constructed just adjacent to the holiest site in the Jewish religion. Now, one of the longest empires to govern this territory was the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which stood for 400 years, from 1516 to 1918. Until the late 19th century, residents living in the region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea identified themselves primarily in terms of religion. They were mostly Muslim, although some Jews did migrate there. But living in that area did not imply any sense of common political purpose. Up until the end of the 19th century, you could not speak of a Palestinian people, and there was no Palestinian national movement. If you asked the people living there how they identified themselves, they most likely would have said that they were Arabs. A specific Palestinian identity did not emerge until the beginning of the 20th century. Now, during World War I, the Ottoman Empire was on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary and was at war with the British and the French. And the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, and the conquering victorious European powers then divided the land that had been previously under the Ottoman Empire. And as we will see, they identified this land as the land they referred to as Palestine. Now, none of what I've already said is meant to deny that Palestinians have a just claim to this land, or that Jews have a just claim to the land. What I've pointed out is that any claim by either side is based on some historic legitimacy that is questionable at best. Now, the birth of modern Zionism can be traced to the birth of modern Zionism can be traced to the late 19th century, when, at that time, there was rising anti-Semitism in Europe, pogroms in Russia, and the Dreyfus Affair in France. And so many Jews felt unsafe. And some Jews argued for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Theodor Herzl was a Viennese journalist who came up with this idea of a Jewish homeland. Now, Jews began to immigrate to that area in the Middle East that we've been talking about. And so if we look at this chart, it shows the numbers and percentage of Jews and Arabs in the land of what became Palestine to the Palestinians. So in 1914, they were just about 75,000 Jews out of a total population of almost 800,000. And so the Jewish population was 7.6%. And it increased slightly by 1918 and to 11% by 1922. Now, during the time of Ottoman rule, the Ottomans decided to allow foreigners to buy land in Palestine. They wanted to encourage investment. And so Jewish settlers went to Palestine and bought land from absentee Arab landowners. So think about this. Here you had peasants working on the land, peasants who never met the owners of the land because they were absentee landowners. And then at some point, Jews buy the land from these absentee landowners, and then they come to Palestine and they tell the peasants working the land, well, I'm sorry, but this land is ours now, and you have to leave. So that created tremendous tension between the inhabitants under the Ottoman Empire and the new Jewish arrivals. Jewish settlers began to establish institutions. They set up businesses, and they began to grow profitable crops. By 1914, Arabs in Palestine were growing increasingly concerned over the growing influx of Jewish immigrants, and friction erupted out of questions such as what are the precise boundaries of the land purchased by Jews. Now, by 1914, Jews owned only 2% of the land in Palestine. Nevertheless, the indigenous population was alarmed over the increasing number of Jewish colonies in Palestine. Now, by the second half of the 19th century, Arabs began to reject Ottoman rule, and they dreamed of a large, united Arab nation. And as a result, a specific Palestinian brand of nationalism emerged early in the 20th century. And that nationalism was spurred by resentment against what they considered Jewish encroachment. Educated Palestinians began to think in terms of a Palestinian nation, and the first Palestinian nationalist organization was formed at the end of World War I. Now, as I mentioned, in World War I, Great Britain fought against the Ottoman Empire, and that conflict changed Palestine forever. It was in the interest of Great Britain to get the Arabs living under Ottoman rule to rise up in revolt against the Ottomans. That would certainly help Britain during World War I. And so, in 1915, as a result of an agreement called the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, this was an agreement between McMahon, the British High Commissioner of Egypt, and Hussein bin Ali, the Sheriff of Mecca. And the agreement was that if the Arabs were to rise up against the Ottoman rulers, then Britain would see to it that Arab independence would follow after the end of the war. And as a result, the Arabs did rise up against the Turks. That uprising was fomented in part with the help of Thomas Edward Lawrence, whom you know as Lawrence of Arabia. However, that wasn't the only agreement concerning the future of Palestine. A second accord was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was an agreement between Georges Picot of France and Mark Sykes of Britain, by which Britain and France agreed to deny Arab independence at the end of the war, and instead they would partition the Middle East among themselves. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a direct contradiction of the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. And if this wasn't confusing enough, there was a third agreement concerning the future of this land, and that was the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration confused the situation even further. Sir Arthur Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary, and in 1917, he issued a declaration that stated His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, as you can imagine, for Palestinians, this declaration represented a symbol of Western treachery and deceit. Not only did it renege on the McMahon promise for Arab independence, but to Palestinians, the Balfour Declaration was the height of British arrogance. Here, Great Britain in 1917 was promising a land that it had not yet conquered to a people not yet living there without asking the inhabitants who were living there. And Britain promised that land against the wishes of the majority of the people who had lived there for hundreds of years. Now, despite the historical significance, there was much about the Balfour Declaration that was ambiguous. For example, it said nothing about a Jewish state or a Jewish nation. It only referred to a home for the Jewish people, but it never defined what that meant. It also did not set any specific deadlines. While the Declaration seemed to protect the civil and religious rights of all people living there, it did not say exactly what would happen to the majority Arab population. Nevertheless, Zionists applauded the Balfour Declaration as redemptive, a document that promised to return Jews to their ancient and, in their view, their rightful home. But the Arab population denounced the Balfour Declaration as an arrogant proclamation of Western imperialism. The League of Nations, which was created after World War I, then granted Britain a mandate over Palestine. A mandate is territory given to Britain and France to govern over until it was deemed that the people living there could create their own governments. And so after World War I, the Middle East was divided between British and French mandates. But then the British divided the mandate of Palestine along the Jordan River, and everything to the east of the Jordan River became known as Transjordan. Everything to the west was referred to as Palestine. And the British maintained that the Balfour Declaration applied only to Palestine and not to Transjordan. And that was to the dismay of those Zionists who wanted to turn all of biblical Israel into a Jewish homeland. Because, as you see on this map, Palestine did not include the West Bank. Now, following the Balfour Declaration, more and more Jewish immigrants began to flood into Palestine. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Jewish population tripled from 10% to 30% by the 1940s. And that increased Jewish presence led to increased hostility between Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And increasingly, Jews were buying up property from these absentee Arab landowners. So here is a map of Palestine in 1948, and all the parts in orange show land that Jews had purchased. And that further inflamed relations between Jews and Arabs. And violence erupted in large-scale Arab-Jewish confrontations during the 1920s, 1930s, while the British security forces tried in vain to keep the peace. After World War II, Britain was bankrupt. It was exhausted by 6 years of war and had no stomach for further conflict in Palestine. It wanted out. And so in 1947, Britain turned the entire affair over to the newly created United Nations. And the UN came up with a partition plan to create a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, according to what you see here on this map. All the parts in purple were to be the new Palestinian state, and all the parts in orange was to be an independent Jewish state. And to get a better idea of this partition plan, the other map shows where Israel would be in relation to other Arab countries. Well, the Jewish authorities accepted this partition plan, but the Arabs rejected it. Now, like so many issues in this controversy, both sides had legitimate and compelling arguments. Palestinian Arabs rejected the partition because it denied Arabs a say in what was going to happen to the land on which they resided. They said that they were denied the principle of self-determination. Self-determination is the idea that people living in a particular place should determine the government that they want to rule over them. And so the Arabs argued that this UN partition plan did not rely on this principle of self-determination. They also pointed out that at the time of the partition plan, Jews owned just 7% of the land, while the UN was planning to give 56% of Palestine to the Jewish state, leaving 44% for the Palestinian state. And that was at a time when the Jewish population numbered 600,000, while the Arabs numbered 1.2 million in Palestine. So to the Palestinians, this UN partition plan seemed incredibly unfair, since Palestinians outnumbered Jews 2-1, since Jews only owned 7% of the land, yet this partition plan would give the new Jewish state 56% of the land. On the other hand, Zionists felt equally justified in claiming a Jewish state out of parts of Palestine. The land of Israel, after all, was the birthplace of the Jewish people, and for centuries, Jewish prayers ended with a plea for a return to their ancestral homeland. Their prayers ended with the phrase, "next year in Jerusalem." In addition, Uh, they argued that the Jews who had emigrated to Palestine built cities and made the desert bloom, whereas before they arrived, it was largely desolate land. And above all, the decimation of European Jews by the Nazis underscored the urgency for the creation of a Jewish nation. So you can see that both sides had legitimate arguments. The Palestinians for rejecting the partition plan, Jews for accepting it. Now, in retrospect, had the Palestinians accepted the UN partition plan, there would have been a Palestinian state. And the history that followed would have been very different. Well, now let's jump ahead to more recent developments. Israel took possession of the Gaza Strip following the 1967 Six-Day War. So as we look at this map, as a result of Israel's victory over 5 Arab nations in 1967, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights, as well as the Gaza Strip, which had formerly been part of Egypt. Now, almost immediately, Jewish settlements began to appear in the West Bank and later in Gaza. At first, Israel gave people in Gaza and the West Bank a large measure of self-government. That is, immediately following the 1967 war, goods were allowed to pass freely between Israel and the West Bank, between Israel and Gaza. And Arab workers were permitted to enter Israel proper without any hindrance. Throughout the 1980s, the Israeli government did nothing, however, to placate the rising frustration of Palestinians living in these territories. The Israeli government also supported Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. And the proportion of the West Bank under direct Israeli control increased from about 1/3 in 1983 to almost 90% by 1988. And as a result, the decade of the 1980s witnessed Palestinian terrorist attacks indiscriminately against civilians in Israel in retaliation for what they said was Israel's military occupation of their territory. And with these terrorist attacks, the Israeli government cracked down with censorship, curfews, the use of live ammunition against protesters, the bulldozing of houses of those involved in anti-Israeli activity. By 1986, there were nearly 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Gaza and some 372,000 Palestinian refugees in the West Bank. And by then, half of the land in the West Bank was under direct Israeli control. The unemployment rate in the Gaza Strip reached 50%. And added to this were the repeated humiliations that Palestinians suffered living under the Israeli military command. Humiliations in the form of body searches, curfews, roadblocks, long waits at checkpoints. And as a result of all of this, the mood of Palestinians in these territories became one of mounting despair. And it exploded in December of 1987 in what was called the First Intifada. The term Intifada is an Arab term meaning shaking off. And so the Intifada was the Palestinian desire to shake off Israeli rule. And this Intifada lasted from 1987 to 1992. It began with stone throwing, as you see in this photograph, but it escalated to strikes and boycotting of Israeli goods. And over time, it grew more violent as leaders urged the killing of Israeli soldiers, Israeli civilians as well. And so many Israelis regarded such acts as terrorism, while Palestinians claimed to be responding to what they called Israel's terrorist act of stealing their country. And with the outbreak of this first intifada, a new organization emerged dedicated to the total elimination of the Israeli state. And that new organization was Hamas. In October of 1993, then President Bill Clinton presided over the signing of the Oslo Accords, which was an interim agreement by which Israel recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the official representative of the Palestinian people. And this Palestinian Liberation Organization then renounced the use of violence, and it recognized Israel's right to exist. Also, part of the Oslo Accords was that both sides agreed to Palestinian self-rule in Gaza and in the Jericho area of the West Bank by the year 2000. So this was the most promising development in any possible peace agreement between Israel and Palestinians. But it was an interim agreement. It was to last 5 years, and then hopefully it would be renewed. However, extremists on both sides undermined these accords. Hamas, dedicated to the total destruction of Israel, sponsored a series of terrorist attacks, including suicide bombings against civilian targets inside Israel. And then in November of 1995, a young right-wing Israeli extremist assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was a signatory of the Oslo Accords. And in the following year, 1996, Israelis elected the conservative Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, and Netanyahu announced his open opposition to the Oslo Accords. By 1998, the 5-year Oslo interim period had expired, and once again, peace in the Middle East had been derailed. So it was extremists on both sides that undermined these Oslo Accords. But Bill Clinton was still undeterred. In the last year of his presidency, in 2000, he was determined to make a final effort at bringing Palestinians and Israel to a peace treaty. And so he dragged the new Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to Camp David in Maryland for a meeting. Clinton was about to leave office, and he desperately wanted to go down in history as the American president that brought about a peace in the Middle East. Now, the Labor Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, offered to withdraw from Gaza and to return most of the West Bank to the Palestinians and to return East Jerusalem to Palestinian control. But the offer did not include the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the homes that they left in the 1948 war. The offer did not address who would control Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. And Yasser Arafat turned down the deal. So the Arabs turned down the UN partition plan, and now this possible peace in 2000. And in 2000, a second intifada erupted as militants targeted Israeli civilians with bombs and suicide attacks on pizzerias, on buses, and discotheques. And in an effort to end the fighting, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, announced in 2003 a plan to withdraw Israeli soldiers and settlers from the Gaza Strip. And that pullout was complete by 2005, although Israel continued to patrol the borders and the airspace above Gaza. Then in 2006, the Palestinians living in Gaza elected Hamas as its governing authority. So now you had the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was renamed the Palestinian Authority, as the governing body in the West Bank, and Hamas as the governing body in Gaza. In 2007, Israel declared the Gaza Strip under Hamas as a hostile entity, and it approved a series of sanctions that included restrictions on imports and border closures. And then in 2008, Hamas launched rocket assaults into southern Israeli settlements, and Israel retaliated by broadening its sanctions, by completely sealing its border with the Gaza Strip, and by temporarily preventing fuel imports. And since then, there has been a series of conflicts in which Israel responds to rockets that are fired from Gaza, and Israel then launches devastating airstrikes aimed at Gaza militants. And those airstrikes often result in civilian deaths as well. And so it was a cycle of provocation and retaliation. And these events occurred in 2009, again in 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2022. And they have occurred so frequently that some Israelis have described these wars against Hamas as simply mowing the grass. That is, just as grass has to be mowed from time to time, Israel, from time to time, has to respond militarily to attacks coming from Gaza. And it really implies a perpetual conflict in which a political solution is unlikely. Now, the international community has severely condemned Israel's, what they say is Israel's disproportionate response that has killed hundreds of civilians in the Gaza Strip since 2009. They argue that most of Hamas's rockets fall short of their targets, or they're intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system, whereas Israeli airstrikes in Gaza are much more devastating. Israel claims it has a right to defend itself against Hamas rocket attacks, against suicide bombings and kidnappings. Now, what these brief wars have had in common is that they were all conflicts that Israel has been unable to win in any decisive manner. And Hamas has also failed to change Israel's policy towards Gaza, despite their periodic rocket attacks. So all that brings us to the horrific attacks on October 7th, which left 1,200 Israelis slaughtered, the taking of 240 hostages, and the Israeli response, which, according to Hamas, has thus far killed more than 23,000 people in Gaza, mostly women and children. So, I'd like to conclude this presentation with some observations about the current fighting in Gaza. First of all, I want to assert that there can be no justification whatsoever for Hamas's savage and brutal attack on October 7th. Now, concerning protests that have erupted in this country, in Europe, around the world, accusing Israel of genocide, of settler colonialism, I would argue that such rhetoric only serves to inflame an already toxic situation. It does nothing to bring an end to the conflict. Israel's attack on Gaza, in my opinion, does not fit the definition of genocide, which is the killing of a large group of people with the aim of completely destroying that group. The death of 23,000 Gazans is certainly alarming, as is the shortage of food and disease that's ravaging Palestinians in the Gaza Strip today. But Israel has not demonstrated that it intends to kill all Palestinians. It certainly has the capacity and the weaponry to do so, but it has not yet done so. However, if Israel continues its current campaign in Gaza indefinitely, then charges of genocide will find a wider audience, as recently demonstrated when South Africa brought charges of genocide against Israel to the International Court of Justice just in the past few days. Israel has also been accused of settler colonialism. That's a type of colonialism in which indigenous people of a colonized region are displaced by settlers who permanently form a society there. The Jewish presence in Israel does not fit that definition. Jews have a historic connection with that land, and the international community has recognized Israel's right to exist. But, in my opinion, the settlers in the West Bank are most certainly colonizers intent on replacing the Palestinians living there. And therefore, I think that that does represent settler colonialism. In the current conflict, it's important to distinguish between Palestinians and Hamas. All members of Hamas are Palestinian, but not all Palestinians support Hamas. Now, Israel's bombing and military incursions into Gaza was certainly understandable in light of the October 7th attacks, but in my opinion, it's really counterproductive. The Israeli goal of completely eliminating Hamas is unrealistic. To do so, hundreds of thousands of Gazans would have to be killed, and that would be totally unacceptable. And even if it were possible to wipe out Hamas, how many future terrorists will emerge as a result of Israel's destruction of Gaza? After all, half the population there is under the age of 25. So, what is the solution? Well, what Israel and Hamas are doing now will only guarantee a repeat of the cycle of violence that has taken place since 2006. The fact is, Palestinians are not going away. If there's any possibility of putting an end to this conflict, in my view, Israel must make concessions for the creation of a Palestinian state. As I said, this conflict is a case of two peoples, both with tragic histories, each with a legitimate claim to territory in the same region. Palestinians have been subjected to military occupation, harassment, dispossession, and indignities for too long. Settler violence, encouraged by Israel's present right-wing government, is aimed at displacing Palestinians in the West Bank. The Palestinian aspiration for a national homeland is as valid as the Jewish aspiration. And so, in my mind, the only viable future for both Israelis and Palestinians is a two-state solution. How we get to a two-state solution is going to be very, very difficult, certainly under current conditions. But in my view, that is the only possible solution to this cycle of violence since the establishment of Israel in 1948. Okay, so